Hello, this is the last programme in the present series of South Bank shows, and tonight's subject is the poet Philip Larkin, whom many other writers regard as the best living poet in the English language. He's 60 this year, and a book of essays just published celebrates his achievements. Poetry, written in English over the last 100 years, has, very generally speaking, been dominated by the work of half a dozen or so great poets. Thomas Hardy's simplicity of language, Yeats' romantic imagery, the complex modernism of T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, the politically engaged poetry of W.H. Auden in the 30s, Dylan Thomas rhetoric. The work of each of these poets seems to have defined for their contemporaries what the subject matter and style of poetry should be at that time. In the 1950s, a number of poets, collectively known as the Movement, began writing what might be called a rational democratic poetry, in which ideas were clearly stated, mainly in traditional verse forms, and the poet whose work best characterized the movement was Philip Larkin. We begin with a performed version of a Larkin poem. Philip Larkin imagines how an American student in the future might look back at him. Posterity.
Jake Belakovsky, my biographer, has this page microfilmed. Sitting inside his air-conditioned cell at Kennedy, in jeans and sneakers, he's no call to hide some slight impatience with his destiny.
I'm stuck with this old fart at least a year. I wanted to teach school in Tel Aviv, but Myra's folks...
He makes the money sign, insisted I got tenure. Well, and as kids, he shrugs.
It's stinking dead, the research line. Just let me get this bastard on the skids. I'll get a couple of semesters leave to work on protest theater.
They both rise, make for the Coke dispenser.
What's he like? Christ, I just told you. Oh, you know the thing, that crummy textbook stuff from freshman psych. Not out of kicks or something happening. One of those old type, natural, fouled up guys.
Philip Larkin's 60 this year. Over the last 35 years, he's established himself as one of our leading poets. In 1964, he appeared in a BBC Monitor programme talking to his friend and fellow poet, Sir John Betjeman.
What sort of attitude do you take to adverse criticism?
Well, I don't know if you feel this, but I feel it very strongly. I read that, you know, I'm a miserable sort of fellow writing a kind of welfare state sub-poetry. Doing it well, perhaps, but it isn't really what poetry is, and it isn't really the sort of poetry we want. But I wonder whether it ever occurs to the writer of criticism like that really one agrees with them. But what one writes is based so much on the kind of person one is and the kind of environment one's had and has now that one doesn't really choose the poetry one writes. One writes the kind of poetry one has to write or can write.
Since that Monitor profile, Philip Larkin has been reluctant to appear on television, and while he cooperated fully in the making of this programme, he declined to appear in front of the camera.
I like the shunning publicity. I like all the fact that he stays where he does, and he's not a performing artist, and I like that because so many people are, and I think he's a kind of example to be aimed at.
Larkin's reputation rests on a small body of published work: 2 novels, Jill and A Girl in Winter, and 4 books of poetry. The North Ship, published in 1945, showed Larkin's debt to Yeats. The Less Deceived, published 10 years later, saw Yeats abandoned, as it were, in favour of Hardy. Then in 1964 came The Whitsun Weddings, followed by High Windows in 1974. Larkin's mature work epitomised the movement.
The main movement poets, Larkin himself and D.J. Enright and John Wayne to an extent, and Kingsley Amis, sought to make a virtue of writing in this plain, down-to-earth, no-nonsense, you-can't-fool-me kind of style. And this, of course, was absolutely at odds with the rather grand, sometimes rather posturing work that one associates with Yeats. Certainly striking a pose, anyway, if not actually posturing. And this was something that went right out. Kingsley Amis's famous remark about let's have no more poems about art galleries and artists and poems about other poems and poems about other poets and so on is all part and parcel of that rejection of anything, any poem which sought to seem at all poetic with a capital P. In other words, they wanted poetry, they wanted to take poetry out of the classroom and put it back on the street.
They fuck you up, your mum and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. They fill you with the faults they had, and add some extra just for you. But they were fucked up in their turn by fools in old-style hats and coats, who half the time were soppy stern, and half at one another's throats. Man hands on misery to man. It deepens like a coastal shelf. Get out as early as you can, and don't have any kids yourself.
Somebody has said that a Larkin ought to be a unit of verse. It's a slim thing like a firkin, not only. You'd have a Larkin, certain amount of verse, quite compactly presented in its own container. I think he's clearly a very economical writer. The question is how deep somebody goes and how wide. He has classical ambitions in that he wants to write about the great things which everybody has in common, an ordinary sorrow of man's life, as Wordsworth says. He's not so interested in the things which you can change by social remedies, by political action. He's more concerned with the things which will always be the same. You can't imagine it not being bad news to get old, or to be unloved, or to see the death of somebody whom you love. Those are his great enduring subjects.
Talking in bed ought to be easiest. Lying together there goes back so far, an emblem of two people being honest. Yet more and more, time passes silently. Outside, the wind's in complete unrest builds and disperses clouds about the sky, and dark towns heap up on the horizon. None of this cares for us. Nothing shows why, at this unique distance from isolation, it becomes still more difficult to find words at once true and kind, or not untrue and not unkind.
I don't think there's anything very unusual except in the exactitude with which he examines these things and sets them down and gives them such memorable cadences again and again. I don't think that... he's not at all eccentric, I think, or idiosyncratic. He's very humorous. I mean, one of the things we haven't talked about is the extent to which the poems have their touches of humour.
This one, I suppose, is about fruitless attempts to lionize Larkin. And it's called Vers de Société. My wife and I have asked a crowd of craps to come and waste their time and ours. Perhaps you'd care to join us? In a pig's arse, friend. Day comes to an end, the gas fire breathes, the trees are darkly swayed, and so, dear Warlock Williams, I'm afraid. It's funny how hard it is to be alone. I could spend half my evenings, if I wanted, holding a glass of washing sherry, canted over to catch the drivel of some bitch who's read nothing but witch. Just think of all the spare time that has flown straight into nothingness by being filled with forks and faces, rather than repaid under a lamp, hearing the noise of wind, and looking out to see the moon thin to an air-sharpened blade. A life, and yet how sternly it's instilled. All solitude is selfish. No one now believes the hermit with his gown and dish, talking to God, who's gone too. The big wish is to have people nice to you, which means doing it back somehow. Virtue is social. Are then these routines playing at goodness, like going to church, something that bores us, something we don't do well, asking that ass about his fool research? But try to feel, because however crudely, it shows us what should be. Too subtle, that. Too decent, too. Oh, hell. Only the young can be alone freely. The time is shorter now for company, and sitting by a lamp more often brings not peace, but other things. Beyond the light stand failure and remorse, whispering, dear Warlock Williams, why, of course.
coming up England by a different line for once. Early in the cold New Year, we stopped, and watching men with number plates sprint down the platform to familiar gates, "Why, Coventry," I exclaimed. I was born here. I leant far out and squinnied for a sign that this was still the town that had been mine so long, but found I wasn't even clear which side was which. From where those cycle crates were standing, had we annually departed for all those family holes? A whistle went, things moved. I sat back, staring at my boots. "Was that," my friend smiled, "where you have your roots?" "No, only where my childhood was unspent," I wanted to retort. "Just where I started. By now, I've got the whole place clearly charted. Our garden first, where I did not invent blinding theologies of flowers and fruits, and wasn't spoken to by an old hat. And here we have that splendid family I never ran to when I got depressed. The boys all biceps and the girls all chest. Their comic Ford, their farm, where I could be really myself. I'll show you, come to that, the bracken, where I never trembling sat, determined to go through with it, where she lay back and all became a burning mist. And in those offices my doggerel was not set up in blunt 10-point, nor read by a distinguished cousin of the mayor, who didn't call and tell my father, "There before us, had we the gift to see ahead?" "You look as if you wished a place in hell," my friend said, "judging from your face." "Oh, well, I suppose it's not the place's fault," I said. "Nothing, like something, happens anywhere." I was born in Coventry in 1922 and lived there till I was 18 and went to Oxford. So I suppose Coventry is my hometown, though I've never been back there to live. I think what I remember from my childhood is largely boredom. I know this sounds very ungracious, but children are often bored, I think. We lived in a succession of houses, quite nice houses with gardens, I suppose. We had servants, or a servant, but everybody did in those days. My father was a local government official and had a spell of going abroad. He was very fond of Germany, which he'd first visited in a study of office methods and so forth, and he hauled us off to Germany once or twice, and that I really found most unsympathetic. Not Germany, but just being in a country where I couldn't understand the language and couldn't read a newspaper and couldn't understand the radio.
He was what you call a very well brought up boy. Always polite. I don't think he caused any trouble to any master in form. Nevertheless, I think he wanted to be a rebel. And he certainly joined in any rebellions that were going on, though normally at a discreet distance. In a way, he was the ideas man behind the rebellions.
Although nobody realized it, I was becoming increasingly short-sized. I couldn't see the board. And from being quite a bright 11-year-old, I turned into a really rather stupid 13-year-old. Coming very low in the class and being a problem to my teachers. I wasn't very well behaved either. And this went on up to the, what was then a school certificate, the O-level stage, which I just scraped over, God knows how, and stayed on into 6, when all was calm and bright again, because I could concentrate on English, which was the only thing I really had any instinct for. I think Oxford, to a very shy provincial, in 1940, it was very intimidating. The exciting side was being in new surroundings with existing friends, most of one's school friends were still there in one college or another. You also met new friends.
He instantly offered me a woodbine, which in 1941 was a great gesture of friendship. And he always had a diffident but friendly manner, and noticeably amiable, always. The kind of life that one led collectively together was a very normal, easy-paced undergraduate life. So there's a larger collective, you were the crowd, and what did the crowd do? Well, the crowd played some jazz records and listened intently to them. Talking during them was bad form. The display of enthusiasm, yes. Then perhaps off to the pub, where talking usually about the affairs of the group, college matters, the iniquities of the tutorial system, all that kind of stuff. Then more drinks, back, more records. But very little of what one's supposed to get as an undergraduate, discussions of the meaning of the world, certainly the meaning of literature or art, anything of that sort.
That was the exciting part then, as I suppose it is now, just meeting people from different but similar backgrounds, with similar likes, who read the same things, but who'd read things you hadn't and who hadn't read things you had, so there was a constant interchange.
I tried Auden at school and made very little of him, but under Philip's pressure, I took a second look. Wilfred Owen, I think rather as it were via Auden, on Auden's recommendation. John Betjeman, who I knew then known only as a writer on architecture. And rather surprisingly, Dylan Thomas, who I think Philip went on liking for quite some time, though one wouldn't have thought that temperamentally, I thought they were quite unlike.
Larkin left Oxford in 1943 and became a librarian in the public library at Wellington in Shropshire. It was to be the start of a very productive period of writing.
Feeling strange and being away from friends and home and so on, I think did create a sort of raw state of mind in which is always very fruitful. People tell me my trouble now is that I've got too comfortable. They say, get up and go to Baluchistan or something like that.
After 3 years at Wellington, Larkin held a post at University College Leicester, and then for 4 years he was at Queen's College Belfast. In 1954 he came to Hull as the librarian of the Bryn Mawr Jones Library, and he's remained in Hull ever since.
When I came to Hull, it was a new place and I found it very exciting. And I still do, in the sense that it is just a little wedge of England, a bit off the beaten track. But I still find that people scan railway timetables and from London and think, oh, well, it's easier to go to Newcastle or to Edinburgh than to bother about Hull. And the lonely place, to me, is always an exciting place.
I think that it is the fact that he's so rooted where he is. When Auden writes about place, and even in a way when Betjeman does, they're actually visitors to the place. They're tourists. They come and then they leave. Whereas Larkin is there, living there, imprisoned there, I mean voluntarily, but I mean in that sense he seems to be a more honest poet in a way than there.
Larkin has written a number of poems based on particular events he has observed. One of the most famous is the Whitsun Weddings, which begins in Hull.
That Whitsun I was late getting away. Not till about 1:20 on the sunlit Saturday did my three-quarters empty train pull out. All windows down, all cushions hot, all sense of being in a hurry gone. We ran behind the backs of houses, crossed a street of blinding windscreens, smelt the fish dock. Thence the river's level drifting breadth began, where Skye and Lincolnshire and water meet. All afternoon, through the tall heat that slept for miles inland, a slow and stopping curve southwards we kept. Wide farms went by, short-shadowed cattle, and canals with floatings of industrial froth. A hothouse flashed uniquely. Hedges dipped and rose, and now and then a smell of grass displaced the reek of buttoned carriage cloth until the next town, new and nondescript, approached with acres of dismantled cars. At first, I didn't notice what a noise the weddings made each station that we stopped at. Sun destroys the interest of what's happening in the shade, and down the long, cool platforms, whoops and skirls, I took for porters, larking with the mails, and went on reading. Once we started, though, we passed them, grinning and pomaded, girls in parodies of fashion, heels and veils, all posed irresolutely, watching us go, as if out on the end of an event, waving goodbye to something that survived it. Struck, I leant more promptly out next time, more curiously, and saw it all again in different terms. The fathers with broad belts under their suits and seamy foreheads, mothers loud and fat, an uncle shouting smut, and then the perms, the nylon gloves and jewellery substitutes, the lemons, mauves and olive ochres that marked off the girls unreally from the rest. Yes, from cafes and banquet halls up yards, and bunting-dressed coach party annexes, the wedding days were coming to an end. All down the line, fresh couples climbed aboard. The rest stood round, the last confetti and advice were thrown, and, as we moved, each face seemed to define just what it saw departing. Children frowned at something dull. Fathers had never known success so huge and wholly farcical. The women shared the secret like a happy funeral, while girls, gripping their handbags tighter, stared at a religious wounding. Free at last, and loaded with the sum of all they saw, we hurried towards London, shuffling gouts of steam. Now fields were building plots, and poplars cast long shadows over major roads, and for some 50 minutes, that in time would seem just long enough to settle hats and say, I nearly died, a dozen marriages got under way. They watched the landscape, sitting side by side. An Odeon went past, a cooling tower, and someone running up to bowl, and none thought of the others they would never meet, or how their lives would all contain this hour. I thought of London, spread out in the sun, its postal districts packed like squares of wheat. There we were aimed. And as we raced across bright knots of rail past standing Pullmans, walls of blackened moss came close, and it was nearly done, this frail travelling coincidence, and what it held stood ready to be loosed with all the power that being changed can give. We slowed again, and as the tightened brakes took hold, there swelled a sense of falling, like an arrow shower sent out of sight, somewhere becoming rain. I thought I wrote it pretty quickly because I've always said that this was one poem that anybody could have written. You simply had to sit in a railway carriage and see what went on and write it down afterwards. But when I come to look at the manuscript, I find that in fact it took not only an enormous time, but I didn't even stick to it very, very conscientiously. I started it off sometime in the summer of 1957, would it be? It was first published in 1959, in June. In fact, when I go back to the sort of journal I was keeping at the time, the only mention I have of any railway journey in which I noticed a lot of wedding parties was in July 55, which is nearly 2 years previously. So you see, I was completely wrong. Yes. And what's more, you know, so far from thinking this is a wonderful poem and dead easy to write, I must have left it in my mind, and you know, for the best part of 2 years until I actually started to write it. I can't understand it. This is not the way I normally work. You'll see very easily from these pages how I write. I advance very cautiously and slowly, and when I think I've got far enough, I cross it out and rewrite it, and then try and get a little further and then cross that out and rewrite it. And I think many of the things I mention here are what survived in the finished version, or one or two odd things. I say I was cross, I say from pique, no doubt, or fed up, no doubt. Well, I don't remember being fed up, but very likely I was. However, that was elided as being irrelevant. And it goes on until there, where I've really established the first verse and got where the sky and Lincolnshire and water meet. And then inexplicably I drop it. And that was sometime in the summer of '57.
Between May and the end of July, Larkin wrote the next 4 stanzas.
You see, I'd got them all onto the train, and now I had to decide what I was going to say about them. I had the sense of different lives, different marriages, all setting off in different directions. And for a bit I sort of laboured away at this. You know, one pair within a week would set up house beneath the, half-lit sea? Half-lit sea. In 70 years, another pair would meet the press, perhaps describe their wedding. And this was all drivel. I was trying to think of what would happen to them all. And so it goes on into August. I mean, there's almost a month between those 2 pages. Well, we're on to September here, yes. It's the end of July, it's the beginning of September. And so I reached the end of the book when I was beginning to think about London, its postal districts spread out in the heat. I thought of London now spread out below the sun in postal districts of the heat in empty offices. Well, then the book gave out, and I went into the middle of another book I'd begun to use for something else, oddly enough. I was trying to summarize London as it seemed to me on a summer afternoon about 5 o'clock, and what I ultimately arrived at was I thought of London spread out in the sun, its postal districts packed like squares of wheat. I was trying to get both the tightness, the overcrowdedness, if you like, but also the fruitfulness. I suppose I thought spread like fields of wheat just wasn't thick enough and dense enough. So that was I was trying to get at. Packed like squares seemed much thicker and denser than spread like fields. And of course, then having aimed them at London, I had to get them there. I mean, I had to make them arrive, and that was awfully difficult. I really did not know how to describe the arriving. I had the sense of a kind of simultaneous arrow shower and rainfall, which was, I suppose, deeply symbolic in various ways. But I hadn't the faintest idea what to put. I mean, there's a sense of falling like an arrow shower, a sense of arrows falling in a shower that was rain also. Don't know what that was. I don't know whether, in fact, the end of this is as good as it could be, but it certainly worried me a good deal. Well, eventually I finished it on the 18th of October. We slowed again, and as the Titan brakes took hold, the swell, the sense of falling like an arrow shower, sent out of sight somewhere. Turning to rain, well, you see, becoming rain must have been put in the typescript. There are some people who say a poem is never finished. I don't agree with that, but it's certainly true that it's never finished in manuscript. Type makes it look very different, and all sorts of unsuspected weaknesses catch your eye, and you start getting busy again.
Larkin has established the Bryn Mawr Jones Library at Hull as one of the most substantial university libraries in the British Isles. His presence there has itself attracted a younger generation to study and teach at the university.
He certainly is somebody that you can drink with and converse with easily. He's immensely courteous and friendly and generous with his time, I think. I think that his fame and his temperament make him not always the most approachable of people, and I'm sure he wouldn't want to be that either. I mean, I think there is a sense of him preserving his talent and his own time in an extremely busy and demanding job, which might very well take away the time, and in doing so, sap the talent. That's not to say that it compromises his commitment to his job at all, because obviously that's very important too.
For Larkin, being a librarian has proved an ideal complementary activity to writing. He's produced a number of poems about work and the need to earn a living, the most famous being Toads and Toads Revisited.
Toads was written in 1954. The other one, Toads Revisited, I forget when that was written, but it showed a certain change of attitude. The first one, as you know, was wholeheartedly against work. I thought it was very hard that I should have to give up my whole day in order to have an evening, if you know what I mean. But the later one began to wonder whether I didn't really rather like work, and it wasn't better fun and more consoling and reassuring than hanging around the park in the afternoon, as I probably should have been. So really, I don't know what I'm grumbling about. I mean, I only need 2 hours in the day, and, you know, how is one going to fill in the rest of it? That is, I think, quite a problem for most poets. The best thing to do is to have some kind of lucrative job that doesn't require creation, you know, doesn't mean you have to write something else. Or, I would say, think about other people's poems, which of course would rule out teaching and lecturing. I would hate to spend my day thinking about other people's poems.
Why should I let the toad work squat on my life? Can't I use my wit as a pitchfork and drive the brute off? 6 days of the week it soils with its sickening poison, just for paying a few bills. That's out of proportion. Lots of folk live on their wits. Lecturers, lispers, losels, loblollymen, louts. They don't end as paupers. Lots of folk live up lanes with fires in a bucket, eat windfalls and tin sardines. They seem to like it. Their nippers have got bare feet, their unspeakable wives are skinny as whippets, and yet no one actually starves. Ah, were I courageous enough to shout, "Stuff your pension," but I know all too well that's the stuff that dreams are made on. For something sufficiently toad-like squats in me, too. Its hunkers are heavy as hard luck and cold as snow, and will never allow me to blarney my way to getting the fame and the girl and the money all at one sitting. I don't say one body's the other one's spiritual truth, but I do say it's hard to lose either when you have both.
Philip Larkin on the South Bank Show, production number 30287, part 2, take 1.
It surprises me that people pick on unhappiness as the principal, well, not the principal, but the overriding quality in my poems. I think a lot of my poems are very funny. I can't help laughing sometimes when I read them. I think others are very clever in a smart kind of way. Certainly is a lot of unhappiness, but you see, no poem is really unhappy. I mean,
The making of a work of art, if I can be pompous for a moment, is never an unhappy thing. I mean, even the most miserable work of art in the world is a peal of joy to the author. You know, it's like laying an egg. There is an evening coming in across the fields, one never seen before, that lights no lamps. Silken it seems at a distance, yet when it is drawn up over the knees and breast, it brings no comfort. Where has the tree gone that locked earth to the sky? What is under my hands that I cannot feel? What loads my hands down? The trees are coming into leaf, like something almost being said. The recent buds relax and spread. Their greenness is a kind of grief. Is it that they are born again and we grow old? No, they die too. Their yearly trick of looking new is written down in rings of grain. Yet still the unresting castles thresh in full-grown thickness every May. Last year is dead, they seem to say. Begin afresh, afresh, afresh. You can't write a poem out of emotion only. If that's all you've got, then, you know, you'd be better off drinking or ringing somebody up about it. There's got to be a second, more impersonal element. I once said, you know, every poem has a fork side, which is a kind of lump of experience that you're holding down, and then a knife side, which is a side that's cutting it up and rendering it manageable. Side by side, their faces blurred, the Earl and Countess lie in stone, their proper habits vaguely shown as jointed armour, stiffened pleat, and that faint hint of the absurd, the little dogs under their feet. Such plainness of the pre-Baroque hardly involves the eye until it meets his left-hand gauntlet, still clasped empty in the other, and one sees with a sharp, tender shock his hand withdrawn, holding her hand. They would not think to lie so long. Such faithfulness in effigy was just a detail friends would see, a sculptor's sweet commissioned grace thrown off in helping to prolong the Latin names around the base. They would not guess how early in their supine stationary voyage the air would change to soundless damage, turn the old tenantry away, how soon succeeding eyes begin to look, not read. Rigid, they persisted, linked through lengths and breadths of time. Snow fell, undated. Light each summer thronged the glass. A bright litter of bird calls strewed the same bone-riddled ground. And up the paths the endless altered people came, washing at their identity. Now, helpless in the hollow of an unarmorial age, a trough of smoke in slow suspended skeins above their scrap of history, only an attitude remains. Time has transfigured them into untruth. The stone fidelity they hardly meant has come to be their final blazon, and to prove our almost instinct, almost true. What will survive of us is love.
What he's trying for is something which is, from one point of view, very stony. The Earl and Countess lie in stone. You think it's going to say that they lie in state. They do lie in state forever on their tomb, but they lie in stone, and what they have is a stone fidelity. But he wants to combine that with something which is blurred, their faces blurred, as when you get near somebody when you're going to kiss them, their face blurs. It's a beautiful touch of love, as well as what time does to the stone, the way in which it blurs it away. And when he moves to the final thing that the poem says, I think he's remembering the end of Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn. He's remembering beauty as truth, truth, beauty, which he, Larkin, has said is not all you know on earth and all you need to know. He knows you need to know a lot more than that. When he comes to the end of his poem, he gives you a line which you can read on the page in two different ways, but which you can't say aloud in both of those ways at the same time. You'll remember the end of the poem is the way in which it understands that this moment of love on the tomb is something which can prove our almost instinct, almost true. What will survive of us is love. Now, if you put the stress on survive, then you have a classical remark. You say, what will survive of us is love. If you put the stress on us, you have a romantic remark. You say, what will survive of us is love. Not only of other people, but of us too. And you can't, if you put the stress on both of them, you sound like some very bad actor at the Royal Shakespeare Company. If you put the stress on neither, you sound as if you're reading some foreign language. But you can read that, you can see that it means at once a great classical thing about everybody, what will survive of us, and it means something about us, what will survive of us is love.
Time has transfigured them into untruth. The stone fidelity they hardly meant has come to be their final blazon, and to prove our almost instinct almost true. What will survive of us is love. The trouble is I got it almost all wrong. It's a most unlucky poem. And to start with, they haven't been lying like that since the Middle Ages. The hand-holding business was done in the 19th century. It was a bit of sentimental addition. Secondly, I've got the hands wrong. Where if I say right, I mean left, and if I say left, I mean right. And then, you know, even somebody said that they had visited the cathedral and was shown round by the guide who stopped the party at this tomb and said, this tomb has been the subject of a poem by Philip Spender. So you see, it's mistakes all along the line. You know, I only looked at the thing for 5 minutes, but on the whole, it has been a very successful poem. I've always tried to write things that need no explanation whatsoever. I've always remembered Kingsley saying that a poem should be comprehensible, not only when you reach the last line, but line by line as you go along.
He's made it quite clear that he thinks that modernism was a huge mistake. Sometimes he thinks it didn't really happen, sometimes he thinks it did happen. And it was well, that all the great achievements, shall we say, round about 1922, great breakthroughs, shall we say, in The Wasteland and in Joyce and in Pound, all these great breakthroughs, especially in literature, do seem to Larkin mostly to have issued in what he calls mystification and outrage. You know, that the real business of the modernist writer, like the modernist jazz musician, he says Parker, he's talking about Charlie Parker, he says Pound, Parker and Picasso, and he spits it out with the alliteration, and he thinks they were all terribly bad news for the arts because they encourage mystification and outrage. When he edits an anthology like the Oxford Book of 20th Century Verse, of course he puts Eliot in, but on the whole the effort of that anthology is to minimize modernism, which is seen as like a great aberration, a great talented, gifted, extraordinary mistake, a huge white elephant really, much too expensive and ruining everything, and instead to establish the continuity with the old tradition, which is Hardy, before Hardy, Browning, before Browning, Wordsworth. But he opens that anthology with page after page after page of Hardy, very, very good poems, very well selected. And what he wants to do is open up that tradition. So it's Hardy and Edward Thomas in the early parts of the anthology, and it's Larkin later in the anthology. That's the continuity, I think, that he's interested in. And he got to it, as he says himself, when he suddenly realized that it was Hardy and not Yeats who really mattered and who really mattered to him. You know, that one day I was woken up early. He has this anecdote about how the bedroom faced inconveniently towards the morning light. The sun woke him early, therefore he had to read. Not one of your reading types, really, but he had to read because he was woken up early, and he read Hardy, and he will never forget that, and that's what made him a poet.
As his works developed, critics have tended to say, and Larkin himself has often said, that that swap of that booting out of Yeats and the welcoming of Hardy. It was something which was absolute. But the longer I look at the poems, the more uncertain I feel about that, or at least what I mean is that I feel certain that that wasn't an absolute swap as he's billed it. In the beginning of, of High Windows itself is an extremely good instance of this empirical, democratically spoken kind of poetry that they're wanting to evolve. When I see a couple of kids and guess he's fucking her and she's taking pills or wearing a diaphragm, you can't really get much more kind of down on the street than that. I mean, in a way, that's characteristic of one side of Larkin's talent, absolutely. But what happens at the end of that poem is that he pushes aside that mode of speech for one which is much more symbolist, I think.
When I see a couple of kids and guess he's fucking her and she's taking pills or wearing a diaphragm, I know this is paradise. Everyone old has dreamed of all their lives. Bonds and gestures pushed to one side like an outdated combine harvester. And everyone young going down the long slide to happiness endlessly. I wonder if anyone looked at me 40 years back and thought, that'll be the life. No God anymore, or sweating in the dark about hell and that, or having to hide what you think of the priest. He and his lot will all go down the long slide like free bloody birds. And immediately, rather than words, comes the thought of high windows, the sun-comprehending glass, and beyond it the deep blue air that shows nothing and is nowhere and is endless.
What you've got in that poem, I think, is a kind of dialectic between the Hardy-ish mode, the Hardy-esque mode, the mode which the movement sought to make a virtue of at the beginning of the poem, and then something which is more nearly akin to the Yeatsian, certainly the symbolist mode at the end of the poem. And I think that argument between two distinct modes of speech is extremely characteristic of the mature work. Oddly, though, it's one which he, in his own remarks about his poems, has often not given any space for, because the line he takes is that when Yeats went out, he went out absolutely. And in a way, I think what Larkin has done is define a middle ground which I, anyway, and I'm sure a lot of other people of my generation feel they can inhabit very easily.
One knows that he isn't going to let one down. He shows enormous unobtrusive skill in rhyme and meter. And that means that he can write very assuredly, with great authority, in unrhymed forms. And I found that it's only poets who have mastered rhyme who can afford to dispense with rhyme. He has done that. So technically, very remarkable, I would say. The most outstanding, certainly since Auden, perhaps since Tennyson. As Eliot said of him, he can make words do what he wants a lot of the time, can't he? But then on the themes, the attitudes, I'm always convinced that he's telling me what he feels, that none of the attitudes, none of the sentiments have been thought up for the occasion or are ones that he doesn't really hold. And that's an immense advantage with a poet who is really telling you most of the time what he feels. And of course, what he sees. I mean, if a novelist is a man with an eye, there's the novelist working through the poetry. I can't think of a writer of this century, except, again, Auden in a different way, who notices things, who can pick things out of a scene that tell us all about it. I mean, one thinks of that little poem, Dublinesque, and I can't remember the actual details there, but there are 7 or 8 details of this twilight or gaslit street scene picked on, all of which are perfection. So, my sort of poet and very much, I think, a poet for our time. Perhaps there isn't an awful lot to be certain about, or to be interested in, or to feel happy about, but there is a lot to be seen and observed and felt.
No, I have never found a place where I could say, this is my proper ground, here I shall stay. Nor met that special one who has an instant claim on everything I own, down to my name. To find such seems to prove you want no choice in where to build or whom to love. You ask them to bear you off irrevocably, so that it's not your fault should the town turn dreary, the girl a dolt. Yet, having missed them, you're bound nonetheless to act as if what you settled for mashed you, in fact, and wiser to keep away from thinking you still might trace, uncalled for to this day, your person, your place.
The poetry of Philip Larkin. And finally, a reminder that the Arvin Foundation is holding another poetry competition this year in conjunction with Sotheby's. There's a total of £21,000 worth of prizes to be won, and the poems have to be submitted by the end of November. If you want to enter, please do not contact us, but write for details and a form to Sotheby's International Poetry Competition in 1982, 34 and 35 New Bond Street, London, W1A 2AA, and please enclose a stamped address envelope. Or you can telephone 01493 2803, 01493 2803. That's all from us for this season. We'll be back early in the autumn. Good night.